The sign was already in the ground by the time my son pulled into the driveway. I watched from the upstairs window, the one that used to look out over my wife's rose garden before my daughter-in-law had it paved over for extra parking, and I watched him stop the car halfway up the drive. Just stop. Engine still running. I could see his head turn slowly toward the red and white for sale sign planted in the center of the front lawn, and I could see, even from that distance, the exact moment his brain registered what his eyes were telling him. He sat in that car for a long time. I turned away from the window and went back to folding my shirts. Let me back up, because the sign is not where this story begins. This story begins the way most disasters begin, quietly, with a phone call, with someone asking for help, and with a man too soft-hearted to say no. My name is Victor. I am 66 years old. I spent 32 years as a structural engineer with the same firm in Columbus, Ohio. And when I retired 4 years ago, I had a pension, a paid-off house, and what I believed to be a good relationship with my son. I had built that relationship the same way I built everything else in my life, carefully, with attention to load-bearing points, with an understanding that the things worth keeping require maintenance. My wife, Carol, passed away 5 years ago, pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 4 months, from diagnosis to burial, and I will not go into detail about those 4 months, except to say that they changed the shape of everything that came after. The house we had lived in for 27 years became a different kind of place. The rooms were the same, the furniture was the same, but the weight of it all shifted in a way I could not quite correct. No matter how many times I rearranged things or repainted walls or told myself I was fine. My son Marcus was 34 when his mother died. He had married Diane 2 years before that, a woman who, I will be honest with you, I never fully understood. She was not unkind to me, exactly. She was something harder to name than unkind. She was careful. She was deliberate in what she offered, and precise in what she withheld. She called me Victor, never Dad, from the very first holiday dinner we shared. I noticed. I never mentioned it. They lived in an apartment in Westerville, about 20 minutes from my house. Marcus worked in sales for a medical supply company. Diane managed accounts at a marketing firm. They did fine. They were not struggling. I want to make that clear, because what happened next had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with opportunity. Specifically, the opportunity they saw in me. It was March, 2.5 years ago. Marcus called on a Tuesday evening and said they were thinking about starting a family. He said the apartment was too small. He said the housing market was brutal right now. Dad, you know how it is. And he said, and I remember the exact phrasing because I have replayed it many times since he said, we were thinking, if you're open to it, maybe we could stay with you for a year or so. Save up a down payment. Get on our feet properly. A year or so. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. The house had 4 bedrooms and I was sleeping in one of them. Carol would have wanted the rooms used. I told myself all of these things, and they were all true. And none of them were the real reason I said yes. The real reason was that I was lonely in a way that embarrassed me, and the idea of voices in the hallway and someone in the kitchen in the mornings felt like something I needed more than I wanted to admit. They moved in on a Saturday in April. I gave them the guest suite on the 2nd floor, 2 rooms, a connected bathroom, walk-in closet. I told them to treat the house as their own. Marcus shook my hand. Diane smiled at me over his shoulder. A smile that was shaped correctly without quite reaching her eyes. The first few months were manageable. I cooked dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. I stayed out of their way on weekends. I asked about work and listened to the answers, and tried not to give opinions that weren't requested. I thought we were doing well, but there is a thing that happens when you are the older person in a house with younger people who are determined to feel at home. It happens slowly, so slowly that you almost don't notice it until you look back and realize you cannot identify a single moment when it turned, only that it did turn, and that you are now somewhere quite different from where you started. It began with small things. The living room furniture got rearranged. My armchair, the one I had sat in every evening for 15 years, was moved to the corner near the window to make room for a sectional Diane had ordered online. I didn't say anything. The thermostat got set to 68 degrees, which was too cold for me. But Marcus mentioned that Diane ran warm, so I bought a sweater. My parking spot in the garage, the one on the left, the one I had used since we built the garage addition in 2003, became Diane's spot because her car was newer and she was worried about door dings. I started parking in the driveway. The refrigerator reorganization happened around month 4. I came downstairs one morning and found that the entire contents of the refrigerator had been shifted. My section top shelf, left side, where I kept my orange juice and my lunch things, was gone. There was no section for me anymore. My items were on the bottom shelf, behind the vegetable drawer, where I had to crouch to see them. I stood in front of the open refrigerator for a long moment, holding the door, trying to understand what I was looking at. I reorganized things back to where they had been. The next morning, they were moved again. I said nothing. By the end of the first year, the year they had asked for, I had quietly retreated from most of the shared spaces of my own home. I ate dinner earlier than they did, to avoid the awkwardness of 3 people navigating a kitchen in which 2 of them had stopped noticing the third. I watched television in my bedroom instead of the living room. I used the smaller bathroom on the ground floor because the master bath, the one attached to my bedroom, Diane had filled with her things and Marcus never mentioned it, and I never asked. I kept waiting for Marcus to notice. He didn't notice. Or he noticed and decided that noticing was not useful to him at that particular time. I'm still not certain which one it was. The second year began without any conversation about the original arrangement. No mention of saving enough. No mention of moving out. No mention of the timeline at all. Marcus got a promotion. Diane's firm gave her a raise. I read both of these things on their faces when they came home on those respective days, the loosened shoulders, the lighter footstep, and I waited for one of them to bring up next steps. Neither of them did. I brought it up once, gently, over dinner, in October of the second year. I said I had been thinking about possibly doing some renovations to the house, asked how their savings were going, asked if they had started looking at listings yet. Marcus said the market was still tough. Diane said they were being strategic. They exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but contained an entire conversation. Then Marcus said, "Dad, you're not in a rush, are you? We thought you liked having us here." And he said it with genuine warmth, genuine brightness in his face, as though the most obvious answer was yes, of course. Take as long as you need. What's the hurry? I have all the time in the world. I said I wasn't in a rush. I wasn't. But I was something. I was beginning to understand something about my situation that I did not want to understand quite yet. Diane's parents came to visit that November. Her father, Gerald, was a large, loud man with opinions about everything and the conviction that all of them were correct. Her mother, Patricia, was quiet in the particular way of someone who has decided that her husband's personality leaves no room for a second one. They stayed for 5 days in the guest suite, which meant Marcus and Diane moved into the room across the hall, which had been, up to that point, the room I used as a home office. No one asked me about the office. Marcus simply said, "Dad, Diane's parents need the guest suite, so we're going to take the office for a few nights. That okay?" The way he phrased it, it was already done. The asking was just a formality, a courtesy shape without courtesy substance. Gerald walked through my house that first evening like he was considering buying it. He commented on the square footage, on the landscaping, on the kitchen layout, on the quality of the appliances, not as a guest complimenting a host, but as someone taking inventory. He asked me what I paid for the house. I told him what I paid in 1997. He nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. At dinner that first night, Gerald sat at the head of the table, my chair. The chair I had sat in every day for 27 years. The chair where I had sat with Carol when we were young and broke and learning how to be parents. The chair I had sat in on the morning after her funeral, alone, drinking coffee I didn't taste. I was already seated when they came down. Gerald walked in, looked at the table, looked at me, and said, "Oh, Victor, would you mind? I've got a bad back. That chair there looks like it has the best support." And he gestured at the chair I was sitting in. Diane said, "Dad, I'm sure Victor doesn't mind." Not asking, confirming. Marcus said nothing. I looked at my son. He was looking at his phone. I got up. I moved to the chair at the side of the table, the one without the armrests, the one guests used. Gerald settled into my chair with the satisfied exhale of a man who has gotten what he came for. Patricia sat beside him. Diane set down the serving dishes. Marcus finally put his phone away. No one said thank you. No one said anything at all. I sat in the side chair and I ate my food and I participated in the conversation when addressed, and I excused myself before dessert because I was not hungry anymore. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink before going upstairs, and I stood there for a moment with the water running, looking at my own hands, thinking about something that happened a very long time ago. When I was 8 years old, my father took me fishing at a small lake about an hour outside of Cincinnati. It was early morning, still dark, when we left the house. At some point during the drive, I fell asleep in the passenger seat. When I woke up, we were parked at the lake, and my father was already outside, already setting up. I sat there for a moment, disoriented, watching him through the windshield, and I remember thinking, with a clarity unusual for 8 years old, that this man would not always be there, that someday I would sit in a car at a lake and there would be no one setting up outside, and I would have to do it myself. Standing at my own kitchen sink, water running over my hands, I had a similar thought. I thought, this is not going to correct itself. This is only going to continue until I do something about it. And then I thought, I am 65 years old. I am in good health. I have a pension and an investment portfolio. And I am the sole owner of a 4-bedroom house in a neighborhood where the median sale price has increased 38% in the last 6 years. I am not a powerless man. I have simply been acting like one. I turned off the water and went upstairs. The next morning I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Park who had handled Carol's estate and whom I trusted completely. I said I had some questions about a property matter. She said to come in Thursday. I drove to her office with a folder I had put together the night before. Bank statements going back 2 years. The original verbal agreement Marcus and I had made undocumented. I knew, but relevant for context. And a notepad with my recollection of specific incidents written out in chronological order. Sandra read through everything without expression. Then she looked up and said, "Victor, they are what we call tenants at will. You have the legal right to ask them to leave, with 30 days written notice. There is nothing complicated about this." I said I wasn't ready to do that yet. I said I wanted to think about it. She said that was fine. She said the option would be there when I was ready. She said one other thing, which I wrote down on the way home. The longer you wait, the more normalized the situation becomes for them and for you. I sat with that for a while. Gerald and Patricia left after 5 days. The house felt different after they were gone, though not better. Gerald had rearranged the books on the shelf in the living room by spine color because he thought it looked cleaner. Nobody put them back. March of the 3rd year was when my birthday happened. I was turning 66. I did not make a large thing of birthdays. Carol and I had always kept them quiet. A nice dinner, a bottle of good wine, sometimes a weekend trip, if the timing worked. After she passed, I marked my birthdays alone for 2 years. And then Marcus and Diane moved in, and I thought that might change. That first year together, they took me to dinner at a steakhouse I liked. It was a good evening. Diane even seemed relaxed, genuinely present. I went to bed that night thinking things were going to be okay. The second birthday, they forgot until late afternoon. Marcus texted at 4:30. "Happy birthday, Dad. We're slammed today. Can we do something this weekend?" Diane sent a GIF. We did not do something that weekend. This third birthday, 66, a Saturday in March, I assumed we would simply not acknowledge it. I was mentally prepared for that. I had made a reservation for myself at a restaurant I had been meaning to try, and I was genuinely at peace with the plan. At breakfast that morning, Marcus said, "Hey, so I know it's your birthday, and I wanted to do something nice. Diane's parents are coming up this weekend. They actually haven't seen the house properly, so we're going to do a birthday dinner here Saturday night. Diane's going to cook. Gerald loves to grill. It'll be good." I looked at him. I said, "Diane's parents are coming for my birthday dinner?" He said, "I mean, it works out timing-wise. They've been wanting to visit, and this gives it a reason, you know? It'll be fun. Gerald's great on the grill." I said that sounded fine. I drove to the library that afternoon. I know that may sound strange. I want to explain it. I had a laptop at home, but it was old and slow, and more importantly, it was in the house where Marcus and Diane were, and I did not want to explain what I was researching or why. The library had fast computers and no one looked over your shoulder. I spent 2 hours reading about real estate market conditions in my zip code, looking at comparable sales, reading reviews of 3 different listing agents, and downloading the contact form for one of them, a woman named Helen Cartwright, whose clients' houses, according to Zillow, averaged 11 days on market. I did not fill out the form yet. I printed it and folded it and put it in my jacket pocket and drove home. Saturday evening, my 66th birthday. Gerald arrived at 4 and immediately went to the kitchen to begin explaining to Diane how he would organize the grill. Patricia arrived behind him carrying a casserole dish and a bottle of wine she had brought for herself and Gerald, which she set down on the counter without offering any to anyone else. Marcus set the table. I sat in the living room reading a book, listening to the sounds of my house being occupied. At 6 o'clock, Diane called everyone to the table. I came in from the living room. The table was set nicely, good plates, candles, the tablecloth Carol and I had bought on a trip to Savannah 20 years ago. I noticed for the first time that Diane had real design instinct when she cared about the result. And this almost moved me, the evidence that she was capable of effort. I moved toward my chair. Gerald was already there. He wasn't sitting yet. He was standing behind it, hands on the back of it, talking to Marcus about something, gesturing with one hand. But he was clearly positioned at the head of the table, clearly had claimed it. I stopped walking. Diane appeared from the kitchen with the serving bowl. She glanced at the table, glanced at me standing in the middle of the room, and said, without breaking her movement, "Victor, you're just there." And she pointed at the side chair, the guest chair, the chair without armrests. On my birthday, in my house, at my table, I looked at Marcus. He was nodding along to whatever Gerald was saying. I looked at the chair Diane had pointed to. I looked at the chair Gerald was standing behind. There is a moment in structural engineering, and I have thought about this analogy many times since, where a load-bearing assessment goes wrong, not because anyone made a single catastrophic error, but because a series of small tolerances stacked up over time until the cumulative deviation exceeded the margin of safety. The structure doesn't announce that it's failing. It simply reaches a point where it can no longer hold what it has been asked to hold, and then it doesn't. I sat in the side chair. I sat there through the entire meal. Gerald told a long story about a property dispute with a neighbor that I suspect he believed was entertaining. Diane and Marcus laughed at the right moments. Patricia refilled her own wine twice without offering the bottle around. The food was good, I will give Diane that. She cooked well when she chose to. At some point, Marcus said, "Oh, happy birthday, Dad," with a kind of brightness that suggested he had briefly forgotten and then remembered. And Gerald raised his glass and said, "To Victor," and everyone drank. To Victor. In Victor's chair, at Victor's table, in Victor's house. After dinner, they moved to the living room. I cleared the table. I did it quietly, methodically, stacking plates the way I had stacked them for 30 years in that kitchen. When the table was clear and the dishwasher was loaded and the counters were wiped, I stood at the sink again, water running, hands not quite dry, looking out the dark window above the basin. I went upstairs. I got the printed form from my jacket pocket. I sat at the small desk in the corner of my bedroom, the one I had paid for, the one that still had Carol's curtains on the windows, and I filled out the contact form for Helen Cartwright. I sent the email at 10:47 that night. She responded Sunday morning. Could I meet Monday at 11? I met with Helen on Monday at a coffee shop on High Street. She was efficient and warm and did not waste my time. She asked about the house, the square footage, recent updates, the neighborhood. I told her. She said, based on comparable sales, she'd price it between $440 and $460. She said spring listings in my area were moving fast. She said if I wanted to list by the end of March, she could have everything ready in 2 weeks, photographer, staging consultation, paperwork. I asked what I would need to do before listing. She said I would need to give current occupants notice to vacate, 30 days minimum, and that the house would need to be shown with as little personal clutter as possible. I said I understood. I drove home and called Sandra Park and told her I was ready. She said she would have the formal notice to vacate letter ready by end of week. She asked how I wanted to deliver it. I said I would handle delivery myself. I spent the next 2 weeks doing what I had not done in 3 years of living like a guest. I paid attention. I moved through my own house with fresh eyes, and I saw it clearly, maybe for the first time since Carol died. I saw the rose garden that was now a parking pad. I saw the books arranged by spine color on the shelves. I saw the master bathroom full of Diane's products, the thermostat set to 68, my orange juice behind the vegetable drawer. I saw all of it, and I took careful notes, not out of anger, not in that moment, but because I wanted to understand exactly what I was reclaiming. Sandra messaged me the notice to vacate on a Friday. I printed 2 copies, one for Marcus, one for Diane, since legally they were both occupants. I put them in envelopes. I set them on the kitchen counter on a Sunday morning when Marcus and Diane had gone to brunch, next to the coffee maker, where they would see them immediately upon returning. Then I went upstairs and began quietly packing my personal items into boxes I had been assembling in my closet for a week. I had already made arrangements to move into a furnished apartment in Bexley, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor with a view of a park. Month-to-month lease. I had signed the papers the previous Tuesday. The movers were coming Wednesday morning. Helen called that afternoon. The sign was going in Monday. Was I ready? I said I was ready. Monday morning I watched from my bedroom window as Helen's crew pulled up and assembled the for sale sign. It went into the center of the lawn, clean red and white. My address on it, Helen's contact information below. They hammered it in with a rubber mallet. It took 4 minutes. They drove away. I watched the street for a while after they left. A neighbor from 3 houses down, a woman named Ruth Ann, who had brought me a casserole when Carol died, slowed her car as she passed and squinted at the sign. I raised my hand to her through the glass. She drove on, and then Marcus pulled into the driveway. I watched him stop the car halfway up. I watched his head turn. I watched him look at the sign the way you look at something that cannot be what it appears to be, something that your brain refuses to process on first pass because the implications are too large. He sat in the car for almost 6 minutes. I timed it. When he came inside, I was in the kitchen, drinking coffee. He came through the front door and walked directly to me with a look on his face I had not seen since he was a teenager. That particular combination of fury and uncertainty, when you are very angry but you are not quite sure if you are the wronged party. He said, "Dad, what is that sign?" I said, "It's a for sale listing. Helen Cartwright's agency. She's excellent." He said, "You're selling the house?" I said, "Yes." He said, you didn't tell us where are we supposed to go." I said, "You received a notice to vacate 2 weeks ago. You have until the end of the month. That's 30 days from the Sunday I delivered it, so you have about 2 weeks remaining." He stared at me. He said, "You're serious?" I said I was serious. He said, "Dad, this is insane. This is our home." I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. I picked up my coffee cup and I said, very carefully, "Marcus, this is my home. It was my home when I bought it in 1997. It was my home when your mother and I raised you in it. It was my home when you asked to stay here for 1 year, to save money. It was still my home on my 66th birthday when I sat in the side chair at my own dinner table so that your father-in-law could sit in my chair. It has always been my home. You seem to have forgotten that. I am simply reminding you." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "That's what this is about? The chair?" And there it was. The thing that breaks your heart a little even when you are doing the right thing. Not because he said it cruelly, but because he said it genuinely. Because he actually sincerely believed that the chair was a small and isolated thing, a minor episode that a reasonable person would absorb and release. Because he had not been keeping track. Because when you are the one with the power, the accumulation is invisible to you. Every individual concession looks manageable from the outside. Only the person making them understands what they add up to. I said, "No, Marcus, that is not what this is about. It is just the last thing. He called Diane. I heard him on the phone in the hallway, speaking in a low, urgent voice. I finished my coffee and washed the cup and set it in the drying rack. Diane came home within the hour. She was controlled. Diane was always controlled, but there was something behind her eyes that was new. She sat at the kitchen table. She said, "Victor, I think we should talk about this rationally." I said I was happy to talk. She said the timing was difficult. She said they had been planning to start looking at houses in the spring, which was the first I had heard of any spring plan, and that this put them in a very hard position. She said she understood that the living arrangement had been imperfect. She used the word imperfect, carefully, with weight, as though acknowledging imperfection were a substantial concession. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "So is there any possibility of giving us more time?" I said, "I gave you 2 years and 11 months beyond what we agreed on. I believe that was more than reasonable." She said, "Victor." I said, "Diane, I want you both to be okay. I genuinely do. You're not bad people. But this is my house and I am selling it, and the timeline is what it is." I paused. "I have already spoken with my attorney. If you'd like her contact information, so you can speak with one of your own, I'm happy to provide it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, very slightly, and left the kitchen. The calls started that night. Marcus called me 4 times between 9 and midnight, each one a different version of the same conversation, cycling through reasoning, then appeal, then anger, then a kind of exhausted bargaining. Gerald called once, from Diane's phone, a brief, aggressive inquiry about whether I understood what I was doing to his daughter, which I listened to politely, and then said I had to go. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 43 calls between the two of them. I answered most of them. I said the same things I had already said, with patience, without anger. I was not angry. I had stopped being angry somewhere around the time I sent that email to Helen Cartwright. And what had replaced the anger was something that surprised me with its steadiness. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop waiting for a situation to improve on its own and simply decide what you are going to do. They moved out on a Thursday, 4 days before the deadline. A moving truck came in the morning. I stayed in my bedroom with the door open, not hiding, but not in the way. I heard them in the hallway, on the stairs, going back and forth. At one point, Marcus stopped outside my door. He stood there for a moment, and I could hear him breathing. He didn't knock. He walked away. Diane knocked. She came in without waiting for an answer, which was very much like her, and she stood near the door with her hands crossed in front of her, and she said, "I want you to know that I don't think you handled this well." I said, "I know." She said, "We needed more time." I said, "I know you feel that way." She said, "Marcus is devastated." I said, "He'll be okay. He's good at figuring things out when he has to." And then I said, "Diane, for what it's worth, I think you're capable of more than you showed here. I really do." I didn't say it unkindly. I meant it. She looked at me for a moment, and something shifted in her face, very briefly, before the control came back. She said goodbye and went back down the hall. The truck left at 2 in the afternoon. I went downstairs and stood in the middle of the living room. The furniture was still there, most of it was mine. The sectional was gone, which meant my armchair was back in the center of the room where it belonged, slightly surrounded by vacancy. I moved it back in front of the television. I sat in it. I sat there for a while, very quietly, in the particular silence of a house that is yours again. The next morning I drove to the library, not for the computers this time, for the quiet, for the ritual of it. I sat in one of the armchairs by the window with a cup of coffee from the machine in the lobby, and I looked out at the parking lot, and I thought about my father, about the fishing trip, about the way clarity arrives sometimes, not all at once, but in the form of small decisions that accumulate into something irrevocable. Helen listed the house the following Monday. By Thursday, she had 8 showings scheduled. By the following Tuesday, she had 3 offers. We accepted one at $452,000, $12,000 over asking, waived inspection contingency, 30-day closing. I called Marcus when I had the accepted offer. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail. I said I wanted him to know the house was under contract. I said I hoped he and Diane were getting settled wherever they had landed. I said I loved him, which was true, had always been true, would continue to be true in a way that was entirely separate from what had happened between us. He called back 2 days later. The conversation was short and careful, two people handling something fragile. He asked if I was really moving to Bexley. I said I was already there, had been for a week. He said he hadn't known I'd moved out. I said the movers came the same Wednesday they moved in. I'd arranged it so we wouldn't be in each other's way. There was a silence. He said, "You planned all of this." Not accusatory exactly, more like someone recognizing the shape of something they hadn't seen clearly before. I said, "I'm your father, Marcus. I've been planning things my whole life. I just usually plan them for you." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I think I stopped seeing you clearly. I don't know when that happened." I said, "I know." He said, "Can we have dinner sometime?" I said, "Yes." I said I'd like that. The apartment in Bexley is everything I needed it to be. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping and one where I've set up my engineering books and a drafting table I bought at an estate sale, where I sometimes work through old structural problems just for the pleasure of it. The park is visible from the kitchen window in the mornings, and in March the light comes in at an angle that Carol would have called the good light, the kind she arranged furniture to catch. I've been going to the library on Tuesday mornings. I take the long way, through the older neighborhood where the houses have that post-war solidity, the kind built with actual attention to load distribution. I look at them the way I always have, assessing, appreciating. Some of them are very well made. They have held a long time. On a Saturday, about 3 weeks after I moved in, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I answered. It was Gerald. He said he wanted me to know that he thought Marcus and Diane were going to be fine. He said they'd found a rental in Upper Arlington. He said it wasn't easy for them. And then he said, and I was not prepared for this, he said, "I've been sitting with something. That night at your birthday dinner. I took your chair." He said it plainly, without decoration. That wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right when I did it. I should have said something at the time. I didn't answer immediately. I was in the kitchen, and I put my hand flat on the counter and stood there for a moment. I said, "Gerald, I appreciate you saying that." He said, "I'm not sure it changes anything." I said, "It doesn't need to change anything. It's still worth saying." There was a pause. He said, "You're a difficult man to stay angry at, Victor." I said, "I've noticed that about myself." He laughed a real laugh, short and surprised. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular. He mentioned a restaurant in German Village he thought I might like. I said maybe we'd try it sometime. We said goodbye. I stood in the kitchen after I hung up, hand still on the counter, and I thought about the house, about Carol's curtains that I'd brought with me and hung in the bedroom window here, about the rose garden that was no longer a rose garden, about my armchair in a room that was no longer my room, about what stays and what doesn't. I thought about what I had told Marcus, that I loved him, that it was separate from everything else, that some things are not conditional on other things, no matter what it looks like from the outside. In structural engineering, there is a concept called graceful degradation. It is the principle that a well-designed structure, when placed under loads it was not designed to carry, does not collapse catastrophically. It bends, it warns, it allows time for correction. It does not fail all at once, and when it does fail, it fails in ways that can be rebuilt. I think about this when I think about Marcus and me, about what we are doing now, which is slowly, carefully, without forcing it, rebuilding something. It is not the same shape it was before. It may not ever be, but it is real, and it is ours, and it is still standing. Marcus came for dinner last month. Just him, Diane wasn't ready for that yet, and that was fine. I made the pot roast Carol used to make, the one Marcus had requested every birthday from age 6 onward. We sat at my small dining table in the Bexley apartment, and he ate 2 helpings, and we talked for almost 3 hours, about his job, about the new place, about some things from when he was growing up that he'd been thinking about. At one point he said, "I don't know when I turned into someone who would do what I did." I said, "You're not that person now." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because you're asking the question. People who are that person don't ask." He nodded. He helped me with the dishes after. He dried while I washed, the way he had done when he was 12 years old, and we stood side by side at the sink and didn't talk much. Just the comfortable sounds of water and plates, and a kitchen that is small enough that two people standing in it are necessarily close. Before he left, he stood at the door for a moment and said, "Thank you for dinner, Dad." Then he said, "I'm glad you didn't wait any longer." I said I was glad too. I closed the door and turned off the porch light and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the park. The trees were just beginning to come in, that early spring translucence, where everything is green and new and not yet full. In a few weeks, they'll be heavy with it. The light will change. The mornings will be different. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the chair by the window and read for a while. And the apartment was quiet in the way of a place that belongs to you. And the night came on slow and easy the way nights do in spring, and I sat there in it, in the good silence of a life still very much in progress. Not finished with me yet, not finished at all.